Good afternoon, everybody, or after morning, I'm not sure yet. Happy noon. I'm Dr. Warren Doctor, President and CEO of the East-Tennessee Historical Society. Thank you all for coming out for our talk today. It's fantastic to see a good crowd. I'm really excited about today's talk. Before we go into today's talk, though, let me tell you about some upcoming events. On April 6th, on Saturday, we have an event. It's our very first time. We're really excited about this. It's called Everyday Arts, and we're going to be showcasing different arts, for instance, pottery. I believe there's going to be some basket makers. Maybe not, I don't know. But there's going to be lots of different local folk artists, and we'll be showcasing that here in the auditorium. We're really excited about that. Also then, on April 9th, we'll be having a workshop called Understanding Tennessee's Cemetery Law, which is very important for anyone working in maintaining cemeteries or genealogical work. And then on April 24th, we're also going to have a program called Don't Let Me Cross Over, which will be accompanying our exhibition on Carl and Pearl Butler. Has anybody been back to see the Carl and Pearl Butler exhibition? It's a lot of fun. If you like early country music, it's amazing. And so I would recommend, if you've not been back, please go back and have a look at it. It's a whole lot of fun. And also I should say that I think over there on that table, we have some of these calendars that will tell you going up all the way into July, all the different programs that we have going on. So you're welcome to have a look at those. Our speaker today, I'm really excited to hear from. I first met Casey when Lisa brought him into my office and we were talking about his work on early maps and cartography. He's a PhD candidate in history at the University of Tennessee and is a historian of early America. Casey's work focuses on the history of cartography and the native South, particularly the Cherokee. His dissertation project is called Given to the Land, Mapping Settler Colonialism in Kituwah from 1682 to 1810. And it examines the relationship between cartography and settler colonialism in Cherokee homelands. And I should also say he's a very prestigious scholar, and I'm not going to sit here and list all of the fellowships because there are many. And he, in my opinion, is an outstanding scholar. He is supported by the National Endowments for the Humanities and has, again, received numerous fellowships at various libraries across the South and has found loads of interesting original maps. And so I'm really excited to hear him speak today. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Casey. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Thank you, Warren. Thank you to Lisa. Can you hear me? Because I'm a walker. Now, you got to get me back over there if I get out. So, had a little breakfast at the Waffle House this morning and to get myself into the East Tennessee mode.
What did you have?
Of course, scattered, smothered, and covered. You had to, So, needless to say, these fellowships I've had in Providence, Rhode Island, and Ann Arbor, and Philadelphia, and they had no idea what I was saying. So, after spending a month last month amongst the buildings and deciding which parking garages not to walk past, this country boy was ready to get back to East Tennessee. I was happy. So I'm originally from Morristown, but I live in Johnson City now. I've been at UT for 5 years now, so I'm not supposed to have the entire history of Tennessee figured out until next spring. So if there's any type of problems today, I'll be welcome to negotiate those. So we're going to talk a lot about Cherokees at war today. I've got my agenda here. So the first thing we're going to go over is our questions, because there's some major questions in East Tennessee history and Cherokee history. People like Tyler Boulware and myself and Chris, we're all writing and trying to answer these questions. So we'll make y'all part of that. Maybe you can help me think through some of these things. Well, first we're going to situate where the 18th century Cherokees were, some of the social structures that the Europeans ran into, and just kind of get our visual bearings of where we're talking about and when we're talking about it. Then we're going to look at the forts in Cherokees, because I know Warren loves forts, so we're going to bring those up, we're going to talk about them, and it's probably not what you're thinking, so we'll kind of negotiate what forts were to Cherokees at this time. Then we're going to look at fighting and defending, how Cherokees, some of their military strategies, all the way from actually what they shot at, all the way down to how they did not get shot. So Their general strategies, and again, it might be a little surprising, so we'll see how that goes. And also their diplomacy. And all of these categories are going to fit into our questions and what we're trying to figure out here. Because if anybody has the answers to the questions, then hopefully your book is coming out soon, because I know the historians and archaeologists and the anthropologists are still struggling with these, so including myself. But we're going to go over some of the diplomacy, and this might be surprising to some as well, because the Cherokees were rather good at pitting people against each other. So we'll start out here. These are our questions that we're going to look at for today. The how centralized were 18th century Cherokees is a massive point of debate. So if you look at older scholarship, it's going to talk about the Cherokees writ large, right? The Cherokees this, the Cherokees that. And it kind of makes the assumption that the Cherokees were one people, and we know that the British came upon this, the French came upon this, and they wanted kings and emperors, and those types of things were not there. But a lot of the early scholarship still considers the Cherokee as just a single polity. But as we've moved forward in scholarship to current scholarship, this has been challenged quite a bit. If you were to ask an 18th century Cherokee person, they would say what town they were from. That would be how they would self-identify. If you told them they were Cherokee, it would be a bit confusing to them, actually. They would say, I am from Kituwah, or I am from Niquosi. That is their community. And towns, as we find out more, are not necessarily locations. They're communities of people. That's why you'll run into old Esto or old whatever, because people move around and it's still an identifier as a community. So we're going to try to figure out how centralized they were. I'm sure a lot of people have heard that there's different dialects, right? You got what they call the upper dialect, Oconee, so it would be where we live now. You have the middle or the Kituwah dialect, which is what people speak in the eastern band. The dialect from here is what a lot of people speak in Oklahoma now. And then the lower dialect is considered dormant at this point. So when the British and other people ran upon this, they noticed these types of regional differences, and they labeled them all kinds of stuff. If you've ever heard of like the upper overhill Cherokees, or the middle, or the out towns, or the valley towns. These were all constructed through interactions with Europeans, but we're going to figure out, is that really how Cherokee society functioned? And also we're going to look at where 18th century Cherokee loyalties lie. Because if you read about what they talk about, the Anglo-Cherokee War, which we're going to question that today, if you read about that, you're going to run into they were British allies, or they were French allies, or they were whatever, allies. Well, we're going to think about that today. Where did their loyalties lie? Can we say that they were allies to anyone? We shall see. So this is just to get you into the mode here. You are here. But the main part of the Cherokee homelands, and we're going to I'm sure you've seen maps like Royce's map from the 19th century where the Cherokee land went from, St. Louis to just north of Charleston, right? We're going to kind of get rid of that and focus on the settlement area, the core settlements, the Cherokee homelands that they would have considered definitely their territory and their land. So somewhere around Clemson areas where Fort Prince George was, or Kituwah, then it would go up to right around here would be Fort Loudon. And all of this area was occupied by Cherokees in the time that we're talking about. So that sets you where we're at. As far as the Long Island in Kingsport, there was no Cherokee settlements there, but there had been constant occupation there for like 10,000 years. So that was a cultural anchor for the Cherokees. There's, of course, a Cherokee mound at Biltmore. So if you ever go walking out in the gardens, stay off of it, right? Probably. Be good. And then all throughout these areas was the core settlement areas. So that's where we're looking at. So one of the first interactions that we run into as we set what the stage was building up to the 7 Years' War, which started in the 1750s, this is the first cartographic interaction after the Spanish. There's a De Soto map from 1534 where Cherokees arrived, but this is the first French map where they show up on the map. So this is from Marquette and Jules wandering down the Mississippi in 1672 and 73, and the Cherokees run into them at somewhere along the Mississippi. We're not exactly sure, but it was a very regular activity for Cherokees to travel along what is now the Tennessee River to the confluences of the Mississippi, Ohio, and Tennessee. Very regular. We run into the written record of that quite a bit. So in this instance, they describe them, and these are the toponyms right here that we get. These would be the Appalachian Mountains, because when they ran into them, they told them, this is where we live, down this river. Now, the nomenclature here, and this is a little interesting, is not Cherokee. This is important. There's something called a bilabal stop, which is a B or P, and that is not in any Cherokee language. So the people that told them these names were Muskogean speakers. We don't know exactly who, but they were. But there's other nomenclature on other maps by a guy named Franklin that says Kituwah on it. So we know that there's Cherokees there too. So that would suggest that this group of Cherokees that ran into the French at this time were bilingual, that there were Muskogean and Cherokees speakers that were there. So when we look at this area throughout this time period, this is where there's a lot of indigenous people in the Southeast being displaced by enslaving groups like the Westos, by disease. So they're coalescing is what we call it. They're coming together and becoming something new. And this is evidence of that. You have Muskogean speakers, and there's lots of Cherokee towns in this area that have a Muskogean etymology that come from Muskogee. So this is evidence of that. They told them, here's where we live. This would be the Tennessee River. That's the word for the Shawnee. And it says it has mines of gold and silver, which would be nice, right? Along with the cool little buffalo. So here's the actual printed journal. This one was at the John Carter Brown. Yes, I left that on there. Good. So this is in French. So if you can't read French, basically the Cherokees were there in a group. It was men and women. They had hoes. They had fusees, guns. They had gunpowder in thick glass bottles. They had whiskey or liquor of some sort. It doesn't say exactly what. And if you ever heard of Chickasaw plums, they had peaches, which he says where was it? He says they're delicious. There's the flow. There it is, which are excellent. So those are peaches that the Cherokee got from the Spanish much earlier and started to cultivate. So they had their own orchard of these things, and they traveled with them. And they had deer meat, and they had bear oil, which, of course, they would cook stuff in. So they had this whole thing, and this interaction tells us a whole lot, right? It tells us that in the early 1670s, which Charleston, was founded in 1670, here the Cherokees are already getting stuff from the English and are taking as far as the Mississippi. So there's a broad sense of travel here, and there's a lot of interchange, right? They're like, oh yeah, you guys are a little weird, because the Marquette comes sailing down this canoe waving a pipe at them because he thinks that they know what that is. And so he has one of his Algonquin interpreters yell at him. And of course the Cherokees are like, so it says that they grabbed their guns like, what is going on? And they never did figure out what the pipe thing was, but they took him in and talked to him, and they had a good meal and that sort of stuff. But this shows us the breadth of the Cherokee travel, the Cherokee trade, and it also gives us an indication of the diversity of Cherokee society. So when we're talking about our first question, how did Cherokee society, how united were they? This tells us that they were bilingual and multi-ethnic at this point in certain instances, which is really interesting. All right. So as we move forward, this is probably, I don't know, the most famous or second most famous map of North America there is. This is by the d'Isles, probably Claude the Dad. They were what they called the Géographie du Cabinet, which is basically people that did not leave Paris They just drew maps from their office. So the eel was nice enough to leave us a detailed record of everything that he used to source his maps. So it went all the way back into the 16th century. He used Spanish sources. He used sources from 1700, from French voyageurs that went down along the coast. That's where he gets a lot of this information. And some of this nomenclature here in the Cherokee area is also clearly from Cherokee sources because it's got the Cherokee word for field or pasture, and it's got the Cherokee word for island. So we don't know what the Cherokee told them. The Cherokee language is super active. In other words, it's almost all verbs, so it's probably we live near a prairie, or we live in the water or near the water, and that's where he gets this nomenclature from. This map is also famous, I have to always mention, because it's why Texas is named Texas. It's the first map that has Texas right in through here. So if you're from Texas, thank the eel. That's where it came from. But this map, along with being interesting for seeing what the French thought was going on, here we have Cherokee on both sides of the mountains, at the heads of the rivers, and here as well where we live. But this is really setting the stage for the conflict. The 7 Years' War is considered the first global war, not long before the Great War in Europe. So you can see this is kind of a cartographic salvo here. French territory, they have all of this, and then they squish the British over here to the very side. So when the British saw this map, they were not happy. And there's all kinds of comments, and they commission new maps. You know, we want to see new maps where we have actual land and stuff. But this was considered an insult, and it got all the way to the Crown and the Board of Trade saying this is what the French are doing. They're invading our continent, right? So you can see this is happening on maps, and maps were part of that. But to situate us, the Cherokee are smack dab in the middle of all this, right? When we see here in a minute some different British maps, it's going to all come down to the Cherokee. They're going to be the linchpin. Where you live was the center of a global war at this time, which is interesting to think about. How am I doing on time? Oh, beautifully. Yes, I forgot to explain. If you want to take out your phone, you can, and the QR code will give you the link so you can zoom all the way in and see the little faces of the people, and it gives you a very high detail one if you want to do that, these are awesome maps. So, all right. So what were the English, or the British by this time, almost, doing? So this is Thomas Narn's map. And Thomas was we'll call him an entrepreneur. And he went from around Augusta, right after the Masters was over, and headed towards the Mississippi and walked in a straight line virtually across the southeast. And this map was an inset on the 1711 Crisp map, so it was broadly viewed. This is sort of the English conception of the southeast at this time. But all he did was walk from Augusta to the Mississippi. So you can imagine if we got up, walked from here to UT, and then I said, well, let's map East Tennessee, it would be a very poor map. So almost all of this information is from indigenous informants. As he went across the southeast, he said, what do I find if I go north on this river? What do I find if I go south? And that's why you have this oddity here with the mountains going east to west. But if anybody here is from Alabama or Georgia, we know the Flint River does not terminate in the Appalachian Mountains, but the Chattahoochee does. So does the Coosa River. And so you can see that this is all indigenous information that he got, and correct information. Right? If he were to say, hey, what do I find if I go up the Savannah River? You're going to run into the Cherokees in the mountains. And on this map you do. So we see a lot of that information coming through on that map. But this is sort of the English conception of the area, and this is right before the Yamasee War, which we'll talk about here in just a second, which terminated in 1715. So at this point, the English are looking for trade partners and groups that will help them enslave other Native Americans. And so that's why he takes this trip. And a guy named Price Hughes does the same thing about the same time, and he made a map, but it's not as good and not as widely viewed, so I didn't put it up there. So this is their conception, and it's right before the war. So the next map is right after the war. Now this is the Barnwell-Hamilton map. There's 4 copies of this. There's only 2 from 1721. This one's at Yale, the other one is in London, and then Georgia has a later one, and Providence has a 1730s version. This is considered the mother map of the Southeast. The nomenclature, the rivers, the names, the towns were used for almost a century after this. So they'll show up in later maps that we're going to look at. But this conception became, this is the Southeast. And again, there's plenty of indigenous information here. Mr. Barnwell was well known for sitting only in his coffee shop in Wilmington and South Carolina and different places. And he got the officials, British officials, got on him sometimes for like, you need to go actually survey. This is what you're supposed to be doing. And so he would get a deputy survey, he said, but he very rarely left his office. So the information on this map is this is the route that he took, Barnwell himself, during the Tuscarora War, and then all this information is from that Norn map, the Price, Hughes, and Thomas Norn going back. But the Cherokee area, by this time, had been visited very, very rarely. There were some traders at this time, but there was nobody that did much geographic. There was also the Vennard Survey, which supposedly there was a group for the propagation of the gospel that went and counted people. So we don't know exactly about that. There's some circumstantial evidence, but this comes out as Cherokee information. But once again, right after the Yamasee War, the British here are very concerned with the Native nations because during the Yamasee War, South Carolina, or the Carolinas period, almost got wiped off the map. Almost all of the colonists were killed. It almost got completely destroyed. So also right at this time, if you're from Georgia, consider yourself lucky because you're about to be called the Margravate of Azilla. And there's several maps from this time. And what the whole part of this was is they said, well, the Yamasee Wars didn't go well because we weren't fortified. We didn't have forts. We need forts. So there's books that people publish saying we have an idea. This guy, this rich guy, came up with the Margravate of Azilla, and they were going to have whole towns fortified and just go in blocks everywhere. Everything has to be fortified. So the Yamasee War really scared the British into thinking this is going to be difficult to continue to settle here. We need to figure out what's going on with the native people. So this map reflects that. You got a lot of information on the Cherokee. Assessing the little text, if you bring it up and zoom in, will say how many warriors it has in each section. And that's repeated throughout here. The Creeks, which it says they're the most violent, obviously because they were the ones that attacked the British. It says they're violent and goes through how many warriors they have. So the Cherokee were actually, if you read the scholarship, it says were allies to the British in the Yamasee War. They saved them, which is kind of true, but were they allies? I don't know. We'll get into that. So this is setting you up right after the Yamasee War. The British were very concerned with the military might of the natives, particularly their buddies, they thought, the Cherokees, and their enemies, they thought, the Creeks. And then out west, again, looking for trade partners and wondering what the French are up to at all times. All right, so as we progress here a little bit, this is George Hunter's map from 1730, and this kind of gives us some clues into what type of prying the British are doing at this time. They're trying to go through, figure out who lives where, how much power they have. He took a jaunt up the Santee River, got into Cherokee territory, and then the rest of this is mapped from an earlier map. But this shows at this time there's more interaction. Until about this time, the Cherokee and the British did not interact a whole lot. But now you're really ramping up the deerskin trade. And 1 year during the 1730s, there was 56,000 some deerskins delivered to Charleston just by the Cherokee, which is a lot. And we're going to talk about that because they didn't like carrying them there, as you can imagine. So the final part of setting you in is this is the British answer to Deil's map. They said, oh, heck no, this is the continent. So John Mitchell's map, this is the most famous map. This map was used at the Treaty of Paris in 1783 to draw the borders of the United States. This was the map laid out as they talked about it. The nomenclature here would look familiar if you zoomed in because it's taken straight from the Barnwell-Hamilton map. All of this is plagiarized by earlier maps, but you can see what the main thing is here. The message is that all of the colonies, according to their original charters, go all the way to the Pacific Ocean. This is British territory, and now Louisiana's stuffed over here. So once again, the Cherokee at this time, when you the start of the 7 Years' War, are the linchpin. They're right in the middle of what everybody is claiming. Now, there was even a book, if you were really rich, that you could buy, and the first page would have a map that showed just the indigenous people, and you rip that off in front of your drunk buddies, and the next one is the Eels map showing Louisiana, and you rip that off to reveal Mitchell's map and the British owning of North America, which would, of course, have been quite a surprise to all the native people that actually lived there. All right, so let's talk about forts. This is a map that was drawn right after the 1760 invasion by Colonel Grant, which we'll get into. But the main thing that we have to think about forts is they were very differently conceived by Cherokee than they were by the British. So the British conceived them as defense, right, as owning the land. We saw after the Yamasee War, the plans were we have to fortify everywhere. That's going to save our settlers. But the Cherokee saw forts a little closer to, say, Walmart. These were nodes of commerce, right? They were spaces for Cherokee women. They were spaces for Cherokee traders. And they wanted the forts built next to their towns. They would come to Charleston, they tried to get Virginia to build a fort, which Virginia did build a fort next to Fort Loudon, but the Cherokees considered it, I guess, a Dollar General store more than Walmart, and so they ignored it and tore it down. But they solicited people to build these forts within their territory, which is tough to imagine, right? Even with somebody you're kind of friendly with. If, France said, hey, we're going to build a military base in Knoxville, we'd be like, I don't know about that. So they saw them as nodes of trade, and they solicited them to be built there. And when they built these forts, the British built them on models that were supposed to go against other European powers. That's why you see the way that they're designed, right? So they're designed to take control of this river. They're designed to withstand cannon fire, right? Like the Cherokee's going to roll up with a tank or something. And that's not what was going on. They didn't consider the fact that the Cherokees could surround it and they couldn't eat, which we'll get into. But so that's how the British conceived them as defense for the area, as being part of the owning, and also as defense against the French. They were always worried what the French were doing. But the Cherokees wanted them there at this time. Please build a fort. This is where we can trade. For the women, this is where we can find men, which we'll get into. So they have very different conceptions. So this is a plan of Fort Loudon. And this is, of course, the one that is near here, right? It's inundated now, but you live very near it. This is DeBram's original plan. The fort didn't turn out quite this, what would you say, nice, elaborate. But what's interesting here is it has, you see the M right here, which is this building. It's labeled the barracks for the Indians, okay? So they had a place in their own fort for the Indians to come. So we'll hint at why that might be here in a little while. But there's also labels of where the pass from the Cherokee towns were. So these were set up for commerce in the end. The Cherokees wanted them placed in certain sections. So there's a different map of this that shows a larger area. And Warren asked about this, but DeBram was concerned with cannon fire or different types, like a French ship coming up the Tennessee River. But as far as the Cherokees, he wanted it placed near briars because he said that he thought that the Cherokees fought naked and wouldn't run through the briars to ever find them. So he goes, if we put up a wooden palisade that has reeds and briars, we're safe. So a very different understanding of how combat worked between the two sides as well. So you can see within this plan, this is a fort, yes, but there's a place for the Indians inside the fort, which is interesting. You know? Here's, everybody loves Henry's map, so we'll show it. This was after the fort was destroyed, but you can see the approximate location to all of the Cherokee towns that surround it. Right? So they wanted it right in their territory because they felt like this was a place that they could come. And as far as authority, the Cherokee thought that they were mistreated a lot by the traders. So they considered a fort a place to go to complain. Somebody that can handle this and make it better for us instead of being overcharged, or a lot of times they would try to liquor them up and charge them extra, different stuff like that. They wanted a place to appeal to, and a fort was that. So very different conceptions between the two as far as what forts were. So it kind of answers some questions as far as who were they allied with. I don't know, right? They're letting them build forts in there, but we'll see how that turns out in the end. So moving towards combat and war, I love to talk about good old George Chicken. He's got to be my favorite character. So Colonel Chicken visited the Cherokees twice, once in 1717, which this journal is from. So if you ever want to become a historian, you better have some bifocals, because a lot of the stuff looks like this, and it can take a little while to push through. So I thought I'd put that original copy up. But he also came in 1725, right? And so he was trying to get them, the Cherokee, to fight the Creek at the time, because as we talked about with the map, this was right after the Yamasee War. So he thought the Cherokees would help him out, so he kept looking for kings or headmen. And this kind of gets into our question of how the social structure was. So he came up with that there's lower people and upper people. So he wanted the lower people to meet at Niquossee, and he wanted the upper people to meet at Tennessee, which would be Chota, which would be in this area. So he was trying to make these distinctions too, but it was frustrating to him because he couldn't find an actual authority figure, because all the Cherokee would tell him was, well, we're going to have to go home and talk. We'll have to talk. And so he finally makes one of the Cherokee mad enough to tell him the real deal. So the Cherokee says, listen, buddy, we only go to Charlestown because you give us gifts, but then when we get back, we don't do what we promised. And then he says, we will go to work when we want to, and we'll go to war when we want to. So leave us alone, because Chicken was trying to get them to build forts and this sort of stuff. So this real difference again in what combat and war looked like. So for the Cherokees, war was strategy, and it was about obtaining a known advantage. So as you go through the sources, you'll look and see if there's Cherokee where they have 10 and the other people have 5, they're going to fight. But if the other people have 10,000 people and they don't, they're going to hide. And that is a consistent strategy throughout Cherokee history. So they will come back, they will try to track and see how many people there are out there. That's why they don't have forts, is because they know somebody's coming, and then they decide, are we going to go and get them, or are we going to leave? So this is a consistent strategy that always frustrated the British quite a bit. So as we move forward in time here, there's a lengthy conflict between the Cherokee and the Creek during this time. And a good story from it is Nonyehi, which will kind of get into how many warriors are in the Cherokee in that one map that's labeled on there. Well, they forgot to count the women, because Nancy Ward, Nonyehi, her husband got shot. She grabbed his rifle, led the charge, and won that battle. So she was always considered a warrior. And in Cherokee society, if you were a guy and you didn't want to hunt, they didn't care. You can do whatever you want. If you were a woman and you wanted to fight, you could fight. So if you're going to count the warriors, you better count everybody. So we move forward here to getting into the 7 Years' War. This is a powder horn map. It was made as a celebration of Grant's expedition into the Cherokee territory. So the story kind of goes like this. In the late 1750s, there was conflict, and nobody can say exactly why. They'll say, well, the Cherokees, they killed a few settlers, or there were some settlers that raped some Cherokee women and killed some Cherokee men. And so it built up over time. Now, there's other things at work here that we'll get into, but this is part of the 7 Years' War. So Grant went into the Cherokee settlements, and he tried to commit basically genocide by burning all the fields, stomping the corn, any food that he can find, and destroying the towns. Because when they arrived, of course, they didn't find many Cherokees. They all left, knew they were coming. So when one of the Cherokee headmen go to sue for peace, he tells them, the governor at that time says, you may call Grant a great warrior, we call him the great corn puller, because all he did was come up there and try to destroy their food. But this powder horn is a map that they made to commemorate this, and there was a lot of controversy because he didn't go as far as Fort Loudon. There was reasons for that, but they didn't do what they wanted to the Cherokee because of the Cherokee strategy. But after this time, when they have destroyed all these towns, and you read some old scholarship, it'll say things like, this humbled the Cherokee, it destroyed, all that kind of stuff. In the years after, the Cherokee had a population boom. They had a decade and a half worth of prosperity after all of these towns were destroyed. And so people are trying to figure out why that is. So we've stumbled on to some evidence of why. So this would be a typical Cherokee field. I don't know if anybody here likes sweet potato pie, but the archaeobotanical record shows that starting in the early 1760s, after the Europeans were coming in and destroying cornfields, the amount of sweet potatoes that Cherokee started to eat went up exponentially. And they had gotten them from the Virginians. So basically, in a cultivated area, if you let a sweet potato vine run amok, they can get 40 feet long, and they look like this. So if you're trouncing through as a colonizer looking for cornfields, you're not going to find these, right? And they can leave them in the ground for months at a time, and they're still good. So they were planting these everywhere out where they knew where they were. And so the subsequent invasions, they never found these plants. So they were able to continuously have a very nutritious source of food that was clandestine. Nobody could find it. The colonizers didn't recognize this as an agricultural space. So this is one of the reasons that they were able to recover and do so well. And during the 1776 invasions, which we'll get to, the Cherokee by that time had actually made pits underneath their houses with stone lids that they found remains of potatoes and sweet potatoes in, so they would hide them under there. Even if you burnt the building, you still couldn't get their potatoes. So they ensured that they could have that. So this is DeBram's map from 1766. So this is after that initial conflict, right? And this is hand-drawn on vellum, which is animal skin. And DeBram was the guy that designed Fort Loudon, and he was part of all of this conflict. And a note on this one is you see a marked hole going right here of no settlements. If you have a guess of what that would be your 1763 proclamation line, right, which he would have known about and said, oh yeah, everybody's on one side of that or another, don't worry. Because these are all the settlements that had been destroyed. And that's Fort Prince George, and then Fort Loudon is up here, which at this time would have been destroyed as well. But this gives you a setup of in between these two conflicts. So initially, everybody thinks, well, the Cherokee were the allies, but then it went south. And then as we move forward towards the American Revolution, the rebels, I guess, which the British would have called them at the time, decided to do a four-pronged invasion of Cherokee territory, which Rutherford was one of those. Colonel Christie came through here. But they had a hard time finding the Cherokee once again. Right? So this is one of the provisions that you're supposed to turn in. I thought it was pretty funny because, yes, we need bread and we need beef, but the biggest column is for whiskey. So if you're going to conduct a excursion into Cherokee territory, apparently that's a pretty big deal. So Colonel Christian went through here, and it's almost a comedic story because they have about 1,500 soldiers. They had to stop 3 or 4 times. I read this in his orderly book, to dock people's pay because they kept firing their guns at everything. And once one person would fire their gun, everybody go, "Oh, it's the Cherokee," and everybody would fire their gun. So they're going down through there. And also he says that we started banging our drum, right, to keep in step. So you can imagine there's about 1,500 young, half-liquored Virginians marching through the Tennessee wilderness, banging on drums, and to their astonishment, when they get to the Cherokee towns, the Cherokee are not there. So he gets mad because the Cherokees are suing for peace. They want to know, and they're like, "Well, you can't sue for peace if you're not going to fight." So in this excursion that we call the Anglo-Cherokee War, this whole excursion, there were 3 people that got hurt. 2 of them shot each other, and 1 of them shot himself. They're all American. There was no Cherokee, so it makes you kind of question whether we should be calling this the Anglo-Cherokee War. That sort of evokes this massive organized military conflict, right? So he finds a few towns, getting back to the organization, and burns the towns that he considered were against the Americans at that time. Right? Little did he know the sweet potatoes were protected. So it, again, did not fully humble the Cherokees. They made it sound like it did. So in subsequent treaties, they even had to write paragraphs saying the Cherokees recognized that we went in and militarily defeated you. And if you have to say that, there might be a problem. So this was kind of propagated by stuff like this. This one I did not give you the handwritten. This is a letter, and it is from this area right before these invasions. And it's saying basically that there's people living, and it would have technically been illegal to live on Cherokee territory, on the French Broad, the Holston, and that they're all ready to go to war immediately. Right? It basically says, yeah, we're ready to go right now. And it's because they wanted that Cherokee land, right? Illegally or legally or however they could get it. So this conflict really came out of these illegal settlements, which got encoded even in our Constitution. There's an article in the 1796 Constitution that says we can't live on Cherokee land except for these people and these people and these people, because they've been here for a while. So this was kind of the start of that and kind of the start of why this happened. This is the William Dale's journal at the Filson Historical Society in Louisville, and he was part of the Rutherford expedition. So we said there's 4 prongs. This was one of the other prongs. And it had very similar results, right? Anglo-Cherokee War? I don't know. In this whole Rutherford expedition, again, the only casualties were to themselves. They did enslave some Cherokees. They ran upon some African people and horses and had an auction out in the field to sell those people and horses. But as far as conflict, it didn't really happen. There was no major conflicts in any of this other than one skirmish at a gap, and it didn't involve the Rutherford expedition. And in the record, not Dale's, but another one, the Cherokee were firing at the pack animals and the flour baskets, the supplies that the Americans were bringing. Basically, if they knew if they got rid of them, they'd have to go home. All right, so again, this strategy of getting an advantage rather than leading head on into combat. So we got enough time to talk about Cherokee diplomacy during all this. So we're going to backtrack a little bit. This is a John Stewart map. He was a captain at Fort Loudon, and this is right after it was built. So he drew this map, and here you'll see this is the French settlement. So what happened is this map is tucked into a letter to the South Carolina Governor William Littleton for military intelligence. And come to find out in the letter, it was Attakulla and a big group of Cherokees that went down the river, Tennessee River, right here, and went all the way. This is the Mississippi, and this would be the area between the Mississippi and Ohio, and found a French fort. So they came back to Fort Loudon and said, we found the French. We want to help you destroy them. You've got to give us guns and ammunition and supplies. So this is the map that was in the letter to the governor saying, you've got to give the Cherokees supplies. The French have built this fort right here, and this is right at the start of the 7 Years' War. So they didn't send them any supplies. And, of course, as you know, right after this, you had the 1760 excursion, the downfall of the Allies. Well, we have an indication why that may be. This is also in the William Littleton papers, and it is an agreement of an alliance between the Cherokees and the French that they signed about 4 months before that map was drawn. So a group of Cherokees had also gone to a fort in Alabama and then on to New Orleans and said, we know where the British are. They built a fort right in our house, and if you'll give us guns, ammo, and supplies, we'll help you beat them. So this was intercepted on a sloop and delivered to William Littleton, so he knew about this. So in 1760, part of this alliance that went down was a lot of the Cherokee headmen went to Charleston. Littleton had this paper, and he actually kidnapped them and imprisoned them, then marched them back to Fort Prince George, where they all died of diseases, smallpox. And of course, this was not popular among the Cherokee people, but this was their diplomacy. Right? Not only were they pitting British against French, but they were doing it for their own benefit. So there's a lot of questions as to whether or not this was a galvanized movement, because anytime you go to the sources and ask the Cherokee, well, this town has attacked, these people have killed somebody, the answer will always be, well, it wasn't us. It was the lower people, or it was the people from this town. But this would indicate that might not be the case, because the people were in cahoots. The same headmen that were going to the British forts were also going to the French forts. So who are they allied with? I don't know. So got a couple of minutes for the final map. So this is the McMurray map. It is the second map published in the U.S. after independence, which happened in 1783. This is the map that they presented to the Cherokee at the conference at Hopewell. And in the notes to this, it said it took them a long time to explain to the Cherokee what the situation was, which you can imagine since the Cherokee are gone. And it just says the U.S. in the inset. So this is a large map. They would have laid it out on the table and said, you are under U.S. rule now. So what is interesting is that the Cherokee said they were happy. They didn't want people on their land anymore. So even Nonyehi was at this, Nancy Ward was at this conference and said, this is great. Just stay off of our land. We're glad somebody's in charge here. So again, you kind of see this, we're going to either disappear or we're going to know when we're going to fight, and our diplomacy is to be self-preservationist. And they asked the Cherokee to draw a map, and this is a colonized map for sure. It shows up in the American state papers, but Nonyehi, Attakullakulla, and a bunch of Cherokees drew this map and showed that this is their territory, and they wanted to draw a boundary even at this point. All right, so when we get back to our questions, to circle back, who were they allies with? It's really, the answer is probably themselves. Now, they were self-preservationists. There's a lot of indications now that say they weren't allies to anybody except for themselves. And when we talk about the separation, it seems more and more clear that the social separation was used in convenience with foreigners. That it would be more like a family of 12 kids where they can fight amongst themselves, but if anybody says something about one of the brothers or sisters, they're all against them. You know? So as we continue to develop how we see this, not only their social organization, but who they were allied with, it becomes a complex question, because a lot of times they were duping the people that they were talking to, the Europeans, saying, oh yes, it's somebody else. But in the end, the sources show that we can't really think about the Cherokees as a solely polity. It's a complex, multivalent society that we have to study from different angles. So, thank you. I will take your many wonderful questions. Yes?
You know, when you talked about that, what was the social structure or the hierarchy of the Cherokees for making decisions? Was it really, in the stereotype is all, it was collective, like warriors to warriors, or, you might have a chief, but how did that kind of work?
Well, we don't have a whole lot of sources where somebody sat and watched it.
Yeah.
So we have to kind of infer some things. So first of all, it was a community decision. So an individual community. And there were communities, we can't think of them as towns, got to be communities, because there were towns with multiple council houses sitting right next to each other, which these people would have said, I'm from this town and I'm from this town, but you're right there. So, and there was lots of people involved in this, and women were a mainstay of this, right? This was a matrilineal, matrilocal society, so that's one of the reasons we have these linguistic differences, is because grandmama, then grandma, then ma, then they all lived in one household for many years, and so you don't get a lot of diversity, but these women were in on these decisions. Nanya, he was at the council at the Hopewell. So what they would do is the people would come, the British or the Americans, and say, here's all our demands. And time again, the Cherokees would say, well, hang on, we'll get back to you tomorrow. So they would all go, women and men, and talk about it. And they would come, didn't have to be unanimity, it just had to be kind of a general consensus. And we know that people would, if they disagreed, you could just get mad and leave, or you can continue to argue. But the sort of headman thing is more from a respected person where your argument worked before, right? So Attakullakulla had some troubles. Like he went to London to gain some more status, some more intelligence about how he could do better. But when his diplomacy didn't work out, then people were like, I don't know about this, right? So Dragon Canoe was like, and left. So it was sort of a township, and then there were town clusters, and sometimes the town clusters would get together and talk. Like we have evidence of this with Henry Timberlake, where there would be a sound of some sort, and the other towns would come to this central council, and they would all talk. So it was a multi-valent system, but there was eventually enough of a consensus that that's how they would act. But if you didn't agree, you could go do your own thing. This was particularly frustrating to people like Chicken, because he was like, well, you need to get the whole town, draft one person from the whole region, and go fight the Creeks. And they're like, no, there's like 5 people that'll go. So, but hopefully that answers your question. We don't have an exact, but we know it was sort of this consensus, and we know it was just as many women as there were men talking about it. Yes, sir.
You kind of indicated early that there may be something more to the intermingling between the Cherokee and the traders and soldiers than just the fact that there's men and women there. Were the tribes actually promoting this? Or?
Yeah, so I forgot that story in my getting to the time. So at Fort Loudon, after there was some conflict, the Cherokee took siege of the fort. Right, this is in 1760, right during this time. So what happened was the Cherokee men were starving out the people, starving out the soldiers, but there were women that had their partners in the fort. So this was a very regular thing. The women wanted the forts there because they could have, they weren't husbands, they were baby daddies or partners or however we want to say it. Again, a matrilineal, matrilocal society, they could do whatever they wanted to. And their kids lived with them and their mom, right? So they would pick these partners, and so the women were taking supplies to Fort Loudon soldiers. And the Cherokee men were like, what are you doing? No, this is under siege, and we're trying to kill these people. And the women are like, well, that's too bad. Because we like them, and we're taking it, and if you do anything to us, our brothers will kill you. And the Cherokee men were like, dang it. Yep. And so the siege lasted much longer because the women who had their partners inside there were bringing them stuff all the time. Corn, stuff to eat, blankets. So that's why you see those barracks, is because the women, they interacted not just for trade, but also for procreation, to be blunt. So they liked having those people, and they liked having children that were able to be interpreters and be in both worlds. Like Nancy Ward, the beloved woman, she is Nancy Ward because she got married to a white man, had kids, but she also had Cherokee kids. So she lived in both of those worlds. And those trading posts to them, forts, were a node for that. In the back.
So your sister,
Oh, no.
your big sister, enjoyed your presentation today, and she just wanted the audience to know that you've been fascinated with maps since you were a small boy, Leonard, Stellar, all kinds of maps. And then it sounds like your passion for history, also it sounds you have a passion for history. You took a college class together about 30 years ago, and she was a senior and you were a freshman, and she had to feverishly take notes and barely pass the class, and you didn't take a note the entire time. You knew everything and aced the class.
Just to let you know, my sister has a PhD from UT and is a professor, so she's exaggerating a little bit. But thank you, big sis. Yes, let's get.
I got a question. You mentioned the microbate of a zilla.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about? You said there was a book published calling for the use of forts and defense. Can you elaborate on that?
Yes, I can send you the images of this particular book and everything. But on the Herman Mole map, which was 1720, it shows up, and so this was outside of Carolina. There's two different schemes to found colonies outside of Carolina. There's a map, the Daniel Cox map, C-O-X-E, and he was going to call it Carolina with an A. And so you get that map, and Carolina was going to go from South Carolina's border to Mississippi. And he was kind of a land grabber, swindler type person. That didn't work out. The other one, I can't remember the guy's name, but it's in the book, and it shows up on many of the maps, this Magravate of Azilla, and this was the second plan. This is before Oglethorpe actually founded Georgia, and it was in this area. And yes, there's a book, there's a whole plot of how they're going to do it. You get like 200 people. If you're one of the buddies, then you get a bigger plot of land. If you're just a normal person, a little smaller plot of land. But everything is within these squares of forts. And so there's a illustration of how this is going to be. And so once you found one section, the next section links onto that, like your neighborhood's fences around the houses, right? And you go on and on and on until the entire state is covered with these things, was his plan.
What's the title of the book called? Or the author?
I will look that up. I'll
Send
send it to you. It's a really interesting read. It's like a early 18th century brochure for come here and we'll live in these forts and we'll all be profitable. But yes, I'll send that to you. Yes, sir.
So you talked about the dynamic of the Cherokee not really seeking direct conflict and fading away when they needed to. When did that strategy start to fail and they really became, overcame by the Americans and
All right, well,
that dynamic
yes.
evolved?
So my dissertation will be out in the spring. But let me see if I can summarize this. The failing part of it didn't have anything to do with military action, and it didn't really have much to do with treaties or policy. It had to do with incremental settling that was clandestine, like we talked about with the people on the Holston or on the French Broad. So settlers, if you look at all of the treaties that were signed between the British or the U.S. and the Cherokees during the 18th century, every one of them, either in the discussion ahead of time or in the actual treaty, will say, we want this land because there's already people living there. So people were moving onto their land and crushing their cultural space. It was taking over linguistically. You had a matrilineal society, and the Americans or the Europeans were a bilateral society, so that interrupts that. So their social space to be able to maintain this Cherokee culture just got eroded by simply people just moving in, right? And when they moved in, they changed the land tenure patterns. So you went from Cherokee agriculture, which I have in chapter 2, to a plantation style, enslaved labor, which transforms the land by the types of animals that you use for that and how you privatize it. Right? So if you go back in the early land records, what they would do is they would say, well, we're going to kind of just move here, and people would open land offices no matter what. I don't know if you've ever heard of the state of Franklin, but you live there. Right? So people like Blunt, I'm afraid, and Sevier, they would try to open their own land offices. They started their own state to try to do this. And when the U.S. would not let them in, they contacted Spain. They said, well, we can get the help of the Spanish Empire to make these land titles legal. They were looking for anybody that would make their claim to hundreds of thousands of acres legal. And people the whole time were moving on. So when the Cherokees kept getting backed up, and squished, if you will, culturally, that eventually made it to where there was demographic ascendancy of the Europeans, and they didn't have enough cultural space. So they either had to head to the deep mountains, where you had a very small part, or you had to go to Arkansas or Oklahoma. So I ran into, and hopefully this will help too, petitions when I was in Philadelphia. So the Cherokees and other indigenous people would come to Philadelphia because it was the capital, and right after the turn of the century, and write Thomas Jefferson. And so there were two different Cherokee delegations. There was one that were called the traditionalists that said, we want to have our old life. We want to live the way we want to. We want to move to Oklahoma. And then there were the peoples that said, we want to change to the plantation style. We want to get, quote, civilized and stay here. And they were writing Thomas Jefferson saying, this is what we want to do. We don't trust these other Cherokees, which gets into the social structure. But hopefully that answers your question. It wasn't a military, it wasn't policy, it was this incremental people settling and crowding them out over time. Hopefully my book will be out before 2 years. Yes, sir.
Well, the stories, you were talking about the type of warfare where if they had an advantage, they would fight, but if they didn't, they would tend not to. But was it something to this history of retaliation, such as, well, you killed 7 of ours, so we're going to go kill 7 of yours? Was that part of it also?
It's, all right, so there was the clan system, which we don't know a whole lot about. 7 Cherokee clans where there was, it's sort of there, since you didn't have a hierarchical political structure, it was kind of there the police force. Right? So if you killed another Cherokee, then it was the family's obligation to make it right. And so when this got translated into the European context, it's not the same thing. So basically, a lot of times what would happen is a settler or a trader or something would move on to Cherokee land, do something wrong, or the Cherokee would do something wrong to them, and there was violence and somebody got killed. Right? And then after that, it had to get escalated by both sides. Right? If you were a colonist and there was a farm of women and children that were killed, you're going to write the governor and say, where's the militia? Right? We get a lot of those letters. Hey, send armies, send guns, we need to defend ourselves. And on the Cherokee side, if it went bad, it was up to the family to make it right too. So it kind of got bled into what we think of as conflict between like 2 nations or 2 peoples, when it's really more of an individualistic conflict, right? Almost like if a crime happened today as opposed to a military action. In our mind, we know the difference between that, but it kind of bled together at that time. Does that make any sense? Oh, good.
So you mentioned evidence of Muskogee interaction. Do any of the early maps show artifacts or latency to Yuchi influence for pre-groups?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. They are a Muskogean-speaking people. So, yes, there are toponyms, not just town names, but also labels on Franklin's maps. They're almost all French, But once you get into the later British maps, their toponyms, they're just holdover town names that are maybe Ushi, maybe it's Kasi, or I can't ever pronounce it, but there's a tribe that now lives in Louisiana that was here as well. So there's several Muskogee speaking peoples that were here, and Ushi were one of them, yeah.
My understanding was that the Uchi were linguistic isolate, and that though they joined the Creek Confederation, their language was distinct from Muskogee. I could be mistaken.
No, you are correct. There's two Muskogean families that they've traced the etymology way back, but it's still related to that.
Sure, yeah. It's like dialectic. Right?
Yes, yes, but there could have been, like if you look on like de Brahm's map, if we bring it up, and I don't know if we can get this close in, but when the British and the French ran into these, you'll see here where it says the creeks, but all of these are listed as individual linguistic ethnic groups, right? So creeks was an invention of the early and middle 18th century. So if we go back even to De Ile, you'll see the same thing. He got all of this information from a Alabama Muskogean person that a French voyager ran into right here. And they told him about all of these linguistic groups. So at this point, he's trying to kind of separate them at times or lump them together. He's not really sure. So earlier maps, you'll have all these broken down. So you'll see the Westos, and you'll see the Hoglahees, which are Ushi, or the actual Uchis down along the rivers in Georgia and Alabama. So, but there's that Muskogean etymology for the town places does originate in here. And another interesting one is on this particular map. This is on the de Bram map, and this is also on John Stewart's map, both of these people were in the area. If we look right here at the Clinch River, a lot of maps will, and this one does too, it says up here at top, the Enemy River. If you've ever heard of the Enemy, the original name is right here, Anagooski, which is the Cherokee word for creek, or Muskogean speaker. That's what Doyi told me. He's a Cherokee speaker. So the Clinch River had Muskogean people there, and that's how the Cherokee named that river. Which ones? We don't know. But one of them. Anybody else? I know there's some other good questions.
Well,
Yes.
so I've been doing research for family history for a long time, and there's a guy who was arrested in the state prisons, and there's a book upstairs about all those prisoners, and they give a bio of them. And so this fellow says that my family were living in the old Uchi fields. And this is Monroe County, where he's from. Do you know what that would refer to?
There was Muskogean people that went all the way from this area all the way over to like the Nashville area. So, and then they moved initially down to the Savannah River, where we pick them up, and then again to somewhere in Alabama, and then they kind of got wrapped in with the creeks, even though they would say that they are not. There's still a Uchi band around, so.
I'm thinking it was around Ray County was what he was referring to.
So that might be a reference to an older occupation for sure, which is interesting.
Casey,
Yes.
if you have any more questions, the people on Zoom ask if you could just kind of repeat them.
Oh, sorry.
I can't hear the questions.
Gotcha. I think we're about out of time, so. One more, yes, sir.
Well, this is a real basic question, because I don't know much about Indians, but as a tribe, how did it sort of place with all Indians size? How big a tribe was the Cherokee?
So he's asking how big of a tribe was the Cherokee at that time. They were the most populous in all of the Southeast. Now, we don't have an exact number, but it would have been, north of 10,000. So they were quite populous. they didn't get hit because of their homelands in the Appalachian Mountains with some of the initial smallpox and other diseases until really into the 18th century. So they were quite numerous and much more numerous than, say, like the Chickasaw or some of the other, the ones that we hear about a lot. So they were a large population, yes.
Good luck on the dissertation.
Thank you. I'm almost done, I hope, unless Dr. Magra says I'm not. Well, thank you all very much.